Author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Politics is the pervasive rapping at the door of culture. Like the eponymous raven in Edgar Allan Poe's famous poem, it taps and taps, offering us little but a repeated mantra. And like the protagonist, lovelorn and losing his grip on reality, should we listen to the words of the raven and take them to heart, our souls, from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor, shall be lifted nevermore. With the government insisting that its actions are impacting only the uber wealthy and that you shouldn't believe your lying eyes on the state of the economy, perhaps we're better off not answering that constant, insistent tapping at all. Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we're going to strip down the narrative that the fiscal disaster is not what you think and figure out why the Biden administration thinks your eyes are ready for a good wool pulling. I'd like to say a special thank you to our listeners on KACT on 1360 AM out of Andrews, Texas. Thanks for being part of the team. And remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Let's get started. This doesn't affect you, the voter, or so we're led to believe. Inflation, short supplies, no supplies, mounting tyranny, and a government response that leaves much to be desired. And Joe Biden and friends want you to believe that it doesn't impact you or your family, the potential voter, just those wealthy elites. Well, one person who's not drinking that particular Psaki-inspired Kool-Aid is Liberty Nation Editor-in-Chief, Lisa K. Donner. Thanks for being with us, Lisa.
Hi, Mark. How are you?
Not so bad at all. Now, tell me, what's happening here and across the country? What's it like for regular folks who don't live off the Washington, D.C. faucet of plenty?
Well, it's interesting that you say that because, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. And I live about 20 minutes outside of D.C., and our legal affairs editor, Scott Cosenza, lives about 30 minutes out of D.C. And he took a picture of the local Safeway that he goes to in Sterling, Virginia. And talk about a picture being 1,000 words. The entire produce section was just bare. I mean, there was nothing but shelves. And that's 30 minutes outside of D.C. This is not an issue of people waiting for their Gucci handbag. We're talking about goods and services that are really important to people.
Yeah, I noticed that the avocados are the only thing left on the shelves in that picture. It appears that hipsters don't make it quite so far outside of DC itself. Now, Lisa, you have a family to feed, you have groceries to buy, cars to fuel, and it's hitting your wallet. And how does the administration hope to keep this a secret? And perhaps more importantly, do they really believe that the 2022 congressional elections won't be about the economy this time around?
Well, let me take your first question first, and then we'll get to the politics of it. I think to say that these shortages aren't happening or, they're spotty. I mean, I noticed a couple of months ago that the frozen food aisle, was just kind of decimated all the time. I thought, well, why are people buying so much frozen food?
No lean cuisines. Check out that episode of Conservative 5 on LibertyNation.com.
Exactly. So it's not across the board. I talked to our national correspondent, Sarah Calgo, who lives out in Indiana. She's like, well, we're not seeing anything like that. But you have to take into account things like, I was just listening to a woman on the radio, and she said she owns an auto repair store. And the problem is, let's say you get in a crash. Well, your insurance company will give you a loaner. But the parts are taking so long to get in that the insurance has run out, the rental cars have run out, and they still don't have the parts. This is not okay. They've got to get their kids to school or preschool, or they've got to get themselves to work. These are issues in terms of inflation hitting across, only hitting rich people. I don't understand that. I mean, if I buy a hamburger at McDonald's, okay, and it's 99 cents, and that's one thing. But if a homeless person buys a hamburger from McDonald's and it's $1.49, it's going to hit his wallet worse than mine. So I think inflation really is something that hampers people on the lower end of the economic spectrum. I am not an economist. I am not,
You haven't played one on TV.
Yeah, I'm not playing
Although,
one on TV.
As your significant other half, Mr. Tim Donner, also Liberty Nation senior political analyst, likes to point out, inflation is a tax that hits every living soul. And it really is. It's just so detrimental to your weekly paycheck, the daily money that you set aside for your actual living expenses. And this is especially true for people who have to literally count the dollars in their bank account at the end of the week. If they expect to save $10 or $20 or $30, say goodbye to that. That's gone. There's no more excess saving happening.
Well, okay, let me just point out to you, let's say we're filling up a tank of gas last October. My car would run about $65-$70. Now it's running over $100. You know, that's real money. Especially if you're commuting, you're taking your kids to school. You know, not everybody conducts their business over the internet.
Yeah, for me, it's the sheer disrespect that they seem to have for the average. Let's call them Joe and Jill. They either think that you don't know what's happening, or you think that they'll collude with them in staying silent because, I guess, shock horror, if the truth got out, Donald Trump could be back in the White House. Now, do they really think that people will sell their souls for Joe Biden?
Well, that maybe I should make that a rhetorical question. I would just say that this seems like an administration that's rather out of touch with the ordinary person. You know, they're talking extensively about taxes and making people pay their fair share. And, you know, it's proven that the highest income earners already pay an enormous amount of tax. So, yeah. You know, I just think they're not hearing the American people.
Yeah, it's an age-old problem, really, isn't it? It comes from the idea that they're the wealthy, and they're wealthy because they have oppressed the workers. Now, by oppressing them, you mean you sold them an iPhone or you sold them a computer. That is a form of oppression. But really, this is just, to me, it seems like it's just Marxism under a modern meme. What are your thoughts?
No, I think that's true. And I think they're really going to have to listen as to how this will turn out politically. You know, like you were saying, my better half, our senior political analyst, wrote a really good article on LibertyNation.com today about, you know, what may happen in the upcoming midterms. I mean, this November, we're looking at Virginia and I think one other state.
New Jersey.
Yeah, New Jersey. So we're looking at two gubernatorial races. But here in Virginia, it's, you know, the airwaves are blanketed, pro-McAuliffe, anti-McAuliffe, pro-Youngkin, anti-Youngkin. It's getting to be a tight race here in Virginia for governor.
Yeah, I think Virginia might be on the verge of re-becoming a bellwether state in terms of its gubernatorials, because obviously the interesting thing about this gubernatorial race is that it doesn't fall either on a presidential election year or on a what we term midterms, which is really just congressional elections, because what that means is that the voters aren't particularly driven by a necessity to either put one person in the White House or take a person out of the White House. It's really very much based on issues that are impacting Virginians and New Jerseyans at that particular time. Now, Lisa.
Well, it's interesting, Mark, because 35 years ago, not to cut you off, but 35 years ago when I moved to Virginia, Virginia was a very red state. It really was. And then it started moving to a solid purple. Now you just have to say that Virginia has been quite blue lately. So this will be an interesting race. And certainly I don't foresee the president picking up a lot of steam during the midterms. Of course, that's not historically accurate. So there may be trouble, but I think they have to get down to understanding what American people are dealing with.
Well, yeah, Joe Biden may have to face the music and dance, as they say. Lisa K. Donner, thank you ever so much.
You're welcome, Mark. Thank you.
Now, don't go anywhere. Later in the show, we'll be talking about the FBI going after concerned parents in our special Talking Liberty segment. But before that, after this short break, we'll be back with Andrew Morant to see how Bidenflation is impacting your wallet. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're told inflation is a high-class problem. We're informed that supply issues are a mere treadmill tragedy. Are the talking heads in the Biden administration correct? Have mere mortals been needlessly worried about putting food on the table and paying more for gas? After all, if you're not in the dreaded 1%, surely it won't impact you. Well, that's the fairy tale. And to help us unravel the narrative is our own brother Grimm, economist and author Andrew Moran. Welcome back, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So tell me, I always thought inflation impacted everyone. Was I wrong?
Well, it reminds me of in 17th century France when all the royals and all the high powerful people, they all concentrated in Versailles and they abandoned everywhere else. So they had no clue what was going on in other parts of the country. And that's pretty much the same thing happening in the United States today. All these powerful officials, they're all focused in Washington and they have no idea what's going on in Mississippi or Alabama or anywhere else in the country. But when it comes to inflation, it doesn't impact the rich as much as it impacts the low and middle income Americans. Whether you're sitting in government or you're a hedge fund manager, you're in that top 1% or you're in the top, 0.5%, whatever it is. And you're raking in all the dough and you're tapping into that well of the Federal Reserve money printing. So it doesn't impact you as much as it would as someone living in a Biloxi, Mississippi. And, when the elites are so disconnected from the daily realities of everyday Americans, it's easy to see how dismissive some of these people can be. Like Jen Psaki the other day, she said, it's the tragedy of the treadmill. It's only the whole supply chain is about treadmills. It's just nonsense. But at the same time, you can't fault the administration. When you have some people claiming that inflation wouldn't be high if you count things that are causing inflation to be higher, they have no clue what they're doing. So I can't really fault them for their ignorance and arrogance.
Yeah. So it seems that the Biden administration is trying to make the American public believe that they're just not affected by the supply chain issues or the rising costs of goods. Now, is there any actual data driving that idea, or is it all more of an illusion to help Democrat supporters keep the faith in the run-up to the 2022 midterms?
Yeah, I definitely agree with the latter part. It is probably an illusion on the part of the administration. When you see all the messaging occurring from the administration right now, these supply chains are high-class problems or inflation spikes are high-class problems or, it's going to subside. It really shows how much, they're dismissing issues that are affecting the so-called forgotten man. Fuel, there's going to be fuel problems. You're having, Lisa Donner, she sent me an image recently of a supermarket in Virginia, and the produce aisle was completely empty. It was remarkable to see. This is the United States. You don't see these problems very much. You see them mostly, in Venezuela and on all these socialist countries, not in an advanced economy like the United States. So it's just the government trying to tell you something that you see with your own eyes that you're dismissing what they're saying.
I actually noticed, speaking of that photograph, which I also saw, that was Lisa K. Donner, our Liberty Nation's editor-in-chief, Andrew was referencing there. And that there's actually a narrative coming out in the Fourth Estate that many of these pictures are from foreign countries or from different times, trying to dismiss what people are actually seeing. Now, there's an interesting corollary with this, that in the UK, those who were anti-Brexit, or Remainers as they're often called, they were posting pictures from supermarkets with empty shelves for the last year and a half. And it was, by and large, photographs from foreign countries or from 6 or 7 years ago. But the reality is that although that was a put-up job, as we call it in England, in the US, that was a picture taken by our very own Scott D. Cosenza on the Talking Liberty segment. So this was a real photograph taken recently, and you have the media denying that it's actually happening. Now, surely the public can see through this when they go to fill up their cars or when they do a grocery shop. They see the empty shelves. How do they hope to win on this?
Yeah, it reminds me of that. I don't know if you've ever seen the Marx Brothers movie, Duck Soup. Chick Marx, he delivers that great line. And he says, "Who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes?" The people see it, the people feel it obviously in their pocketbooks. But these politicians, they hardly ever leave the confines of their lavish homes and their opulence in Washington. So perhaps they really don't know what the heck's going on. And if you look at many of the surveys the two premier sources you look to for this kind of information is the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and the University of Michigan. And they publish these monthly surveys surveying the public of their views of inflation. The latest numbers show that people are expecting higher inflation over the next 1 year, 3 years, and 5 years. So the public is obviously not very trustful of the administration or even the Federal Reserve trying to solve this problem. So it just shows once again the vision of the anointed is not the vision of the public. The public doesn't believe anything that's coming out of Washington, nor do they trust that they can solve this problem. Well, nor could they, because it's government. Government doesn't solve problems. Governments exacerbate problems.
That actually does bring me very nicely onto my final question for you, Andrew. It seems to me that people in a position to talk about these things, they're casting away their, let's call it integrity, whatever integrity they have remaining, by supporting what the administration peddles, despite their knowledge that that's just not accurate. And that appears to entail cutting Joe Biden slack regardless of the cost. Now, I think this was made quite apparent recently with the Treasury coming to Joe Biden's rescue. Now, you wrote about this on the pages of LibertyNation.com, but would you care to fill us in on the details?
Yeah, I really found this remarkable because if you watch Janet Yellen in the weeks heading into that October 18th deadline and read these letters she wrote to Congress, her whole message was that if lawmakers don't act, Treasury is going to be running out of money. They won't have any more extraordinary measures to employ to ensure that America can cover its obligations. Out of nowhere, now Janet Yellen says, oh, yeah, we have a few more extraordinary measures we can use heading into December 3rd, which is the next the debt ceiling deadline between the Republicans and Democrats, which only makes me think, okay, so if they once again, let's say, postpone it and delay it again in December, is Janet Yellen going to say out of nowhere, oh, yeah, we have a few more tricks up our sleeves, and now we're going to start miraculously cover the bills again until the next debt ceiling deadline in February or March? So, yeah, I mean, I don't think at all politicians have any integrity or any U.S. bureaucrats, but this is just absurd to me of how, the doom and gloom that was coming out of her mouth so many times, whether it was on Capitol Hill or in television interviews. And also it just shows once again, these people have no clue what they're talking about. I've written about this many times. Janet Yellen was saying there's no inflation. Now she's saying inflation is red hot, but she's still saying that is transitory. So these people are just, it's baffling, and they make six figures a year. They have all these great connections, and how do they get these jobs? They're wrong on everything all the time. Is that one of those when you have these job ads for government, one of the things that you have to be wrong all the time? Is that what's going on in Washington? Let me know. I want that job. I'm glad to be wrong all the time.
Well, Operation Save Joe Biden's Legacy is certainly a high-paying career, but it might cost you your soul. Andrew Moran, thank you ever so much.
Thank you for having me.
You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard across the Radio America network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. Remember, you can tune in for Liberty Nation from 2 to 3 p.m. on Sunday on KBKW 103.5 FM and 1450 AM, the talk of Grays Harbor. Coming up soon on the show, we'll be discussing the latest cases that impact your liberty. But next up, we're going to figure out why Joe Biden is intent on hiring nobody but activists. Don't touch that dial. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
A manager is only as good as the team he or she has around him. And for President Joe Biden, that adage signals a very grim future. Whether it's Vice President Kamala Harris being missing in action on just about every issue to cross her desk, whether it's a border crisis, a botched Afghan withdrawal, wherever one looks, it's disaster after disaster. Is this what you get for hiring activists to run your country? Well, to answer that question, we're joined by Liberty Nation author and editor, Mr. Jim Fight. Welcome aboard, Jim.
Hey, thanks for having me, Mark.
So tell me, has Joe Biden got a blind spot when it comes to putting activists in important government roles? It seems that the idea of a solid track record, experience in the field, is just a thing of the past, and all that matters is being loud and proud on any particular far-left issue that seems to raise its ugly head.
Well, I'll resist the temptation to make a joke about Joe Biden and blind spots, but no, I don't think this is a blind spot, actually. I think the issue is rather that Joe Biden himself is an activist. He's not the most progressive guy. He's got an unfortunate history with women and race, to name a few things. But But he is absolutely a statist and a globalist. And for that reason, he is and has always been an anti-gun activist. And of course, I don't think a solid track record has ever really been all that important to him. Now, the image of one, of course, but you ask, is this just about being loud and proud on all matters progressive? I think we've come to the point where that's it. He kind of has to kowtow to the progressive crowd, and that's great where their issues overlap, like gun control. And on pretty much anything else, I think he's just going to do whatever he feels like he needs to do for the party.
Okay, so let's talk about some of these recent nominations that have passed through the system. We can start with the former ATF nominee, Dave Chipman. Now, how could somebody who was so anti-Second Amendment even make it to a congressional hearing? I mean, surely with the Senate math that's in place, 50 on one side, 50 on the other, and Vice President Kamala Harris casting the decider, did they really assume that somebody with such an anti-gun record would gain all 50 Democrats without even a peep?
I suspect that is what they thought. And it speaks volumes, by the way, that it didn't work out that way, that the guy is so anti-gun that he offended even some Democrats. But yeah, that first question, the kind of off the cuff easy answer is, well, you get nominated by a president. There you go. You're going to have your confirmation hearing. But the somewhat longer answer there is you got to think about what the ATF actually does, right? The ATF, I believe I made this point in at least one of my articles that I talked about Chipman in. The ATF doesn't exist to make sure that you exercise your right to bear arms, right? Like no ATF agent's going to knock on your door and say, hey, do you have a firearm? Oh, here, take this one. That's not what they're here for. So
at least not until Christmas time, surely.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's like the old joke, ATF, alcohol, tobacco, firearms. It should be a department store, not a government agency. But but no, so it would have been most likely devastating to those who enjoy the Second Amendment had he been confirmed. But having said that, Chipman is at least in line with the agency's true purpose and Biden's own personal activism.
Well, speaking of being aligned with the agency's purpose, we have Chris Magnus in the hot seat for head of the Customs and Border Protection. Now, you wrote an article on Mr. Magnus with a good bit of background on him, and it seems to me that his history of supporting sanctuary cities is directly at odds with being head of a unit tasked with protecting the borders. So how does Mr. Magnus square this particular circle?
Well, he takes the same. He took the same tack as Chipman, actually. Just the old, I call it the Judge Dredd Act, right? Just I'm just going to enforce the law. It doesn't matter what the law says. I'm going to enforce the law. And of course, there is a special irony, unlike Chipman and the ATF, to have an open borders, anti-border security activist police chief who has refused to work with ICE to lead an agency, dedicated to border security.
Yeah, it does. On the first day of Chris Magnus's hearings, he refused to call what's happening at the southern border a crisis. Now, it was quite the exchange. It was a fair amount of linguistic wriggling, as he says, I consider it very serious, but do you consider it a crisis? And he wouldn't dare utter the C word, the dreaded C word there. So how much confidence do you think let's call it the average American will have if he gets the job? Now, that's entirely up to the Senate, whether he does or not. But right. What do you think the American people will think if there's somebody who is so anti-border in charge of getting this whole thing organized? I mean, have I got this wrong? Or maybe the border issue isn't a crisis at all?
You keep on with that C word there, Mark. I like how he he danced around that. He would address this with a sense of urgency, all the urgency it deserves. It's a very serious issue, but no, he wouldn't say crisis.
That's an interesting point there. All the urgency it deserves. Now, who determines how much urgency it deserves? Well, that would be the head of the Customs and Border Protection, surely. So if he doesn't see it as a crisis, then perhaps it doesn't require urgency. So he would be dealing with all the urgency that it deserves as determined by himself, correct?
Like you said, there's some linguistic gymnastics going on there. So completely setting aside for a moment the issue of the left wanting open borders, I think, and this is neither for or against the man. This isn't an indictment or a praise or anything, but he's kind of in a situation where even if he did believe that there was a crisis at the border, and I don't think he does. I think he's right along with the rest of the leftists who want the situation to be like it is, or just completely open border. But let's assume for a second that they ask, a senator says, what are you going to do about the crisis on the southern border? And he says, you know what, you're right. It is a crisis, and I'm going to work to adjust it. Well, now he has just thrown everybody under the bus in his entire party, including the man who nominated and can fire him. As far as what confidence will the American people have in him, that's going to decide who you voted for, right? Because if you voted for Joe Biden, then you're kind of in the same boat as Biden, as Magnus, and as the Democrats in Congress. You have two options. You can either say, hey, look, we screwed up, now we got to fix it. Or you can, as the saying goes, continue to play the fiddle while Rome burns and just pretend like there's no problem.
Yeah, I've noticed that many of the politicians nowadays, in their bios, they have, before even congressperson or senator, they have activist and congressperson, or activist and congresswoman or congressman. And this seems to be more of a priority for them. And I think it's great that people who are personally invested in a cause so much that they consider that activism, they consider politics a way of pushing forward with their activism for the cause they believe in. However, the issue there, I think, is once they become elected, they're on the taxpayer dollar. And that dollar, they're being paid to be a congressperson or a senator rather than an activist, because they don't just represent the people who voted for them, they represent the people of the entire constituency. Do you see a conflict of interest there?
And that was kind of a sticky wicket. Personally, I think that anyone positioning themselves as an activist in Congress should be terrifying to the common people. And look, this is, people like Tracy Stone Manning, people like David Chipman, people like Chris Magnus, people like our Attorney General, Merrick Garland. They're exactly why. Senators or representatives who, introduce laws that will seriously curtail liberty for the greater good. They're why. But for a lot of people, a lot of these activist voters, that's great. Of course it's not a problem. Of course it's not a conflict of interest. It lines up perfectly with their interests.
Yeah, all must fall to the greater good. James Fight, thank you ever so much for being here.
Thanks, Mark.
Right after this short break, we're talking liberty with Scott Cosenza. Will the Attorney General letter to Joe Biden over labeling good parents as domestic terrorists have any impact at all? Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with Liberty Nation Radio, here on the Radio America Network. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
The Texas abortion law has become a court ping-pong match. Parents are domestic terrorists, and there's a pushback against the weaponization of the FBI. And that's just for starters here on our Talking Liberty segment on Liberty Nation Radio. Now, there's no one better to help unravel the legal and constitutional issues than Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor and host of the Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire. Thanks for being here, Scott.
Thank you, Mark.
So a couple of quick questions before we dive into the meat and veg of today's segment. Let's start with the Texas abortion law. It seems to be bouncing from court to court to court. how does this actually end? And is the conservative, well, heavily conservative Fifth Circuit likely to be the final arbiter of challenges?
I've got good news for you, Mark. For you and I both. It never ends. There's going to be challenge upon challenge.
There's always TV.
And then however the court rules, the people on the margins of the outside of both sides of the issue, so the most strident of the pro-choicers and the most diligent and vehemently passionate on the pro-lifers, will use their political power to kind of trim around the margins. But I think the answer you probably were looking for is that the Supreme Court's going to rule on this abortion question in a major fashion, or decline to in a major fashion this term. They have already accepted the case. It's being briefed and it will be argued. And that's going to, I think, settle a good bit of this, at least for a moment, until the people who are animated to make a change on both sides start their work.
Okay. And I want to ask you about this new breed of domestic terrorists that are threatening the safety of all of our children and our nation and our republic.
Are you referring, Mark, to the
democracy.
Loudoun County parents?
I am talking about parents, yes, those domestic terrorist parents. Now, You have the U.S. Attorney General, Merrick Garland. He's looking to take these folks to task with threats from the FBI. And it all seems like a targeted campaign to demonize those who speak against the Biden administration's educational and cultural wish list. Now, I have two questions for you on this. Now, first, how can this sit with the First Amendment? Surely it's an enshrined right to question things and to make your opinion in the public, in the town square, as they call it, no matter how against the system your opinion may be.
I call him the 10th Justice, Mark. Merrick Garland, of course, who was supposed to have been nominated, or was nominated rather, and not installed by the Republican Senate. An interesting fact in this regarding this story is that apparently his son-in-law is engaged commercially in an education company that deals with these issues, and he may benefit financially from people not speaking up about it. But you're absolutely right. The First Amendment does guarantee this, and that's why if you parse his language, you'll see talk of threats or some other imposition on the rights of the people who are being talked about. But the announcement itself, I think, and the way it's done has a chilling effect on free speech, and that's why it shouldn't be done. And that's why we should more carefully choose our presidents and have them more carefully choose our attorneys general.
The second question, Scott, is that 17 state attorney generals have written a letter to Joe Biden questioning this move through Merrick Garland to call parents domestic terrorists. Now, am I right in thinking that although these 17 state attorney generals have sent a letter is really, in this case, not worth the paper it's written on?
I'm going to go ahead and just guess without even considering it for one moment that all those 17s have an R after their name, Mark.
Very astute.
It was a politically motivated letter, and you're right, it doesn't have any. I mean, to the extent that, the federal attorney general is wise to consider the considered opinions of the state attorneys general in doing their job. There's absolutely no power they can exercise over him legally, and there is no mandate for him to respect their opinion more than he respects yours and mine.
Which I'm reasonably sure he doesn't. So, Scott, let's move on to the legal cases that we're seeing this week. Now, the Missouri governor has called a journalist who found a security flaw in a system a hacker and has threatened to sue the journalist and the Post-Dispatch for which the journalist works. Could you give us the details on that?
This reporter's name is Josh Renard, and they're a reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and they're also a tech and web expert who writes sometimes for the publication. We'll have to get our tech people up on the author page, perhaps, to get some product out of them, Mark. But what he did was he figured out that in coding their website, the state of Missouri encoded the teachers' social security numbers in the HTML code, the sort of behind the scenes language that a web browser looks at to determine what's displayed on its page. And you and I know, Mark, from our loading of the website, that you can basically turn a button on and you can see what code websites are publishing. This is public information. And that's what this reporter discovered. And you know what they did with the information, Mark? The most responsible thing possible. They alerted the state that they were publishing this private information, gave them an opportunity to stop publishing it, and then published their story about how the state was publishing it. But Governor Mike Parsons, I think perhaps in a senior moment that he doesn't understand how tech works, I'm not exactly sure, has threatened criminal prosecution of this reporter, who again exposed exposed the state's malfeasance in publicly publishing thousands of Social Security numbers of teachers on their website.
Well, as we know, the American judicial system is set up to prevent politicians being embarrassed and nothing more. Now, there's actually a similar situation in the UK, in Scotland in particular, where there's one of the ministers said that this £600,000 system to ensure that people can have COVID vaccination passes on their phones was completely secure, and people got around it. Now, these people are naturally hackers who learned how to take a screenshot and then share said photograph with their friends. People who are doing such a thing are obviously very dangerous criminals. Now, Scott, another issue that
Liberty finds a way. I like it.
Yeah, there's another issue I find quite interesting is that the Capitol rioters from January 6th, now they're facing delays to their trials caused by court backlogs and masses of evidence. Now, what's really going on with this?
Mark, it seems like the federal government, and with some cooperation from the federal judiciary, are doing everything they can to make the road most difficult for the accused in the January 6th riot, insurrection, whatever you want to call it. And it's one of those things where it's so disheartening because these people are supposed to be prosecuted and punished within the law, but having them have to suffer through a punishment outside the law is supposed to be verboten and not part of our system. So making them have extra onerous pretrial detention conditions, which they've had, delaying the eventual rulings on their cases, which we see, to the extent that those things are politically motivated, and they seem to be, they're unacceptable. And that's why I think the story deserves attention. Another instance where these defendants' fundamental rights seem to be being abridged for political purposes. It's bad enough if they're being abridged because of it's a scheduling issue or because of, more innocent reasons, but that they're more nefarious and perhaps politically based, I think is even more important.
Yep, rights are rights, no matter who they're for. Scott D. Cosenza, thank you ever so much.
Thanks, Mark.
And that's about it for this week's episode of Liberty Nation Radio. I want to thank our guests, Lisa K. Donner, Andrew Moran, and James Fight. And as ever, our Talking Liberty star, Scott D. Cosenza, for taking the time to join us. And I want to thank you, the listeners coast to coast, for being here. It's your engagement that makes it all worthwhile. I'd like to leave you with one final thought. Written by St. Augustine in his Confessions, it goes, "It was a day when I was preparing a speech to be delivered in praise of the emperor. There would be a lot of lies in the speech, and they would be applauded by those who knew that they were lies." This strikes me as eerily similar to what's happening today. The government tells us we're better off, and those who support this new naked emperor in the White House applaud, knowing in their hearts that it's all a big lie. The government will lie and spin because that's what governments do. It's those who applaud the falsehoods that are shaming us with their dishonesty. Until next time, thanks for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Who are we? We are Americans that believe in liberty. We are a project of the nonprofit One Generation Away. We are patriots who apply the founding principles to the issues of today.
And they keep moving the goalposts on us.
We are educators and commentators who love America and the Constitution. Who are we? We are Liberty Nation.